So just so y'all know, I was at one point, like, this wasn't just a costume I had for Halloween. I actually was at one point in the medical field. I was just a CNA, but I was working to go higher. Things just didn't work out at that point. So if you're wondering why I have scrubs, there is a reason. They were used. I didn't just buy them just to have them for an outfit. Speaking of which, transitioning, segueing from there, welcome to another Thursday. That means it's time for a gear talk. Today we're talking about Rustlung. So yeah, there's a reason I wore the scrubs for the video. I didn't just come out here just to say, look at me, I'm pretending again. No, I actually have some knowledge in the field of medicine and with the body. So continuing on, we're talking about Rustlung today. Something that a few members of the Gears of War universe actually did suffer from. A lot of people actually, but a few people that had names that we are aware of. For instance, Barrick had this, Harper had this, and since this is Gabe's Convoy's discussion, Ukon had this, and finally Gabe also ended up having Rustlung. Now, we're going to talk pretty much about what Rustlung is, what it does to you, what the symptoms are, and pretty much who it affected and what caused their downfall in the end, if it was the Rustlung or if the Rustlung just played into how they passed. So yeah, talking about Rustlung today, something that really sucks. We should probably start off by talking about what Rustlung is in general, or what it led into, or what it leads into, I should say. So Rustlung happens when emulsion vapors or fumes are breathed in and it affects the lungs. Now the more you breathe in, the more potent the Rustlung is going to be. For instance, at the very beginning of the story, well, mostly towards 2, because 2 is when we actually get a lot more of it. In 2, it's explained that Rustlung is what happens when the emulsion gets into you. Later on, at the end of 3, we understand that everyone pretty much has the very early stages of Rustlung, because at this point, the stalks, all the emulsion on the surface, everyone's pretty much breathed it in at this point. So everyone is pretty much infected. Now, when it comes to people who have higher dosages of this would be like near Timgod when the light mass bomb went off. A lot of fumes and vapors went into the air from that. A lot of people breathed it in. Some of those characters involved Barrick and Harper, which were near that area when it happened. So they had a very high dosage that they were hit with. So I should also say dosage-wise, it's more of what you breathed into. It's not like someone injected a dosage of emulsion into you. That's Adam's territory with what he did to himself. We don't need to jump into that one. That was not Rustlung. That was just him turning himself lambent, pretty much. So once you're infected with Rustlung, this is also the early first stages of Lambency. Now, obviously, like I said with Adam, he kind of just skipped right to it, but you have characters who breathed it in, or they're bedridden and just coughing up, in some cases, literally a lung. They are pretty much, they're going to become lambent. That's what it's going to be. They're going to become the formers, and they're going to become a big problem. Now, when you have the characters that ended up breathing this in, they suffer from many things. Some of the symptoms you get, and there is a long list, I'm just going to name some, you end up getting headaches, joint pain, muscle pain, pain in your lungs. You cough up brownish reddish phlegm, pretty much coughing up blood and the mucus that's in there. You end up having insomnia, and you end up with very high levels of aggression. We are going to get into that one. The aggression plays a major role with some of the characters. Now, it is also important to mention that with Rustlung, once you end up with Rustlung, you really aren't going to get cured. There is no way to get cured except one. It was only done once, and it only worked not even on everybody, just on a large majority because of how early the Rustlung was set in for them. So, pretty much once you get it, you have your death sentence. Now again, it falls into the dosage of how much you breathe in and how much is in your lungs. For those who had a very small trace amount with it and ended up with Rustlung, they can live for decades and they can live for a long time. For those who had a very high concentration or were infected very heavily, you may even have like weeks to months. You don't have a lot of time, because once this stuff is in, it starts spreading and it stays in there. It's not like it just, you can cough it out of you. No, it stays. Once the damage is done, it is done. No cures have ever been found, and even the doctors in the beginning of Gears of War didn't believe Rustlung was even a thing. It was just something that stranded in Gears and civilians were just calling for what was going on. For instance, Dr. Merriweather, who was the head of the Jacinto Hospital, which she becomes more prominent in the books and you learn more about her, she fully believed, like, no, Rustlung, you do not have it. Whatever Rustlung is, you don't. You will get better over time. In fact, she discharged Harper, I believe, stating that, Harper, you're going to make a full recovery and you will be fine. Harper was never going to make a full recovery. It was never going to happen. Harper was never going to get better. Now, later on, we learn what happens to Harper, so we can't tell, if the end would have been he made it all the way to the end and he died because of it. There's only one character we've seen that we know of that's made it all the way to the end with Rustlung, and they died because of Rustlung. We know of one character who did. The rest of them they kind of chose, I'd rather go out swinging than by Rustlung, and we'll take a look at those characters quick. Going over these characters, there's also going to be some history going into it. For instance, we are going to talk about Ukon, and if we talk about Ukon, it is going to take us all the way back to the New Hope facility. So while we look at these characters, I'll end it off on Ukon so that we can talk about the history of it, because it has been around for a long time. It's not like Rustlung just happened within the beginning of the Locust War or even a few years before. Rustlung was around for a while. It's just that no one really had an idea of what it was or how it happened up until more recently. So we'll start off talking about Harper, because Harper is someone brought up a lot in the background of the stories, and he was someone who suffered from Rustlung. He was over near Timgod along with Barrick, and they got it there. So when he breathed it in, it took him a while. In fact, I think it was a few months before his signs started. I think maybe even so he was over in Timgod for about 2 months, if I remember right. Then he was stationed over at Jacinto for 4. And then his symptoms, when he first went in, showed up a month prior. So roughly, it took 4 to 5 months for his symptoms to actually be shown, and it's affecting him. Which, if you look at the story of Gears, between 1 and 2, it's only maybe a few months at most. So maybe half a year, 6 months we could say, because they meet Barrick within that time period. It's not like Barrick was just hey, guess what? I was still around towards the end of the war. No, Barrick died when we start the series 14 AE. He died roughly early. And again, he also had Rustlung. We'll get to him next. Harper ended up with his, and he really had the heaviest set of he would cough up phlegm immensely, he was throwing up at this point, and it was a brownish red sludge. It was bad. Harper had it very bad, and he was in constant pain from Rustlung. But, and I hesitate to even call it a benefit, it gave him a very high level of aggression and rage that played into it. When he was sent into the Hollow for Operation Hollow Storm, he ended up getting captured. And when he was being captured and being moved, he had this anger and rage flare up, and he was able to escape just going fisticuffs on a Locust. That's the thing you also need to understand from Rustlung. And I don't know what could cause it. Maybe it's the emotion itself that could cause this, or just latent strength. Humans aren't really using all of their strength at a given time, because if we were, the body understands there's a higher chance of damaging the body from going too far. So it's subconsciously our body is suppressed to not always be at 100% our strongest. We're normally laying out a way less. For instance, right now, if I were to try and lift a car, that's never going to happen. I'm not going to lift a car up and flip it over. That's not going to happen. If I were to see my loved ones, my girlfriend, for instance, was pinned under a car, I feel adrenaline would probably kick in, and I'm going to be having a lot more strength to move that damn thing. Am I going to move the car? That's up for debate. But I'm going to have more I'm putting into than in a normal situation. And that's kind of what happens when the rage and aggression is put in. You notice it with Barrick and Harper. They're going well beyond what even you'd notice in a human. For instance, Harper was able to go fisticuffs and pretty much win in a fight against a Locust, something that normal humans cannot do, period. Barrick was ripping Locust physically in half with his bare hands. Again, something a human, nay, I say even a trained gear, cannot do. They were doing this. So Harper ended up dying, though, because he got shot and he was taken down in the Hollow. He made it to the surface right in time. He barely made it out, but then he died right there from gunshot wounds. Going on to Barrick, since we've mentioned him so much. Barrick is one of the people who coined up Rustlung from the beginning. He was saying Rustlung, 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 and that's where Merryweather was kind of it's not Rustlung. You don't, but no, he did have Rustlung. So Barrick ended up getting it also, same time Harper did, and when he got it, his signs weren't as you couldn't see them as well as you could notice with Harper or Gabe later on in his life. He physically still seemed like he was very well off and he was fine. Maybe a cough now and then, but he was also a very heavy chain smoker of cigars. Even Marcus brings up those are going to kill you someday. And he says, no, this, I'm going to die way before this even does a thing to me. Because he's referencing his Rustlung. He knows he's going to die from Rustlung. He knows he doesn't have a lot of time. But he decides, you know what? If I'm going out, I'd rather go out a soldier. I'd rather go out on my own 2 feet. I'll smoke cigars and probably drink as much as I want because I'm going to die before any of that hits me. So Barrick was one of the people with Rustlung, but he didn't show it that much. It's not until in 2 you see how much the damage can actually take on you, because he really is just going in out swinging. He literally goes out swinging. He also dies from gunshot wounds. He does not succumb to what Rustlung later brings. Going on, we'll talk about Gabe. Gabe ended up with Rustlung. We don't know the exact time he got it, but he did contract Rustlung. And later on, he lived for a long time. He had a low dosage he ended up with, by what we can tell, because he lived all the way to 30 AE. And he was at the beginning of the war, so he went a good maybe 40, close to 50 years, he was living with Rustlung. Now, towards the end of his life, it did actually drop him into bed. He was bedridden completely, and he is the one and only character I believe we know of that does succumb fully to Rustlung, and the Rustlung does kill him in the end. I haven't read too far in the books to see how the end of his life goes right now, but I can probably assume he was in a lot of pain. Again, Rustlung, when you have it, it's not going to be as bad as like when you go through life with it with a low dosage. It's towards the end when it starts having the heavier toll, and it's going to wear your body out until you can no longer pretty much move, and you're just succumbing to it. Finally, let's talk about Ukon, because this is where we'll get into the history, and then I think we'll just get into the minor facts about it at the end. So, Ukon had Rustlung from his very beginning of his life, kind of up until when he was a child. So he wasn't born with it, but he was a child, and he was picked as one of the people sent over, one of the children, to New Hope. That's where they did the testing, where we get the sires, and where the locust pretty much began. Mira was also brought in. Mira also ended up having... Well, she couldn't get Rustlung. That was the thing. A lot of the children did get Rustlung because the scientists were giving them Rustlung. Were giving them emulsion to have that happen. A lot of the coal miners that were brought in at the time, they weren't even coal miners. They were emulsion miners. They brought in, and normally it was the miners who all had Rustlung. They brought in all the children because they wanted to test and see if they couldn't cure it, and then that just kind of turned into, let's fiddle with genetics and make locusts pretty much. Essentially, that's what it became. And you had the sires as the first thing that happened. All the sires became feral. All of them were sterile from the Rustlung. Ukon was also part of that group. He kept all of his intelligence, though, and he was actually... he wasn't immune to it, but he gained abilities from the emulsion. Like you have with Mira, who normally she had de-aging. She could age very slowly. Ukon kind of gained like rapid healing, so he could easily like grow an arm back. He could do that. He gained those benefits from the emulsion, although the downside is that he did end up for the rest of his life with Rustlung. And as we see throughout tactics, he does suffer from it. He is coughing. He is weaker. You can tell by his body he's a lot more frail than the other sires we've seen before. He is suffering. But because of his like regeneration kind of, it's keeping his body like he's still okay. Like the gas he takes is helping. Not even helping, but it's keeping him alive. He's still healthy enough. He's able to be up and moving, but you can tell he has been affected, and his health is, like, maybe he kept it stagnant. Maybe he found a way to keep it plateaued. But without that gas, without his abilities, he would have dropped a long time ago. And that kind of also covers the history involving Ukon. They learned about it. It was already existing in people and in, like, the miners, for instance, well into the Pendulum Wars. It was already a thing. It was just when people were trying to find a cure for it, that's when it led into the locust situation, and that's when Rustlung was kind of just thrown to the wayside. They were just kind of like, okay, Rustlung doesn't matter anymore. Get rid of it. Doesn't matter. We're making locust now. And for instance, also Reyna's dad, the man who pretty much bedded Reyna to have bedded Mira, not bedded Reyna. Oh my goodness, no. Bedded Mira to have Reyna. It was stated he also had Rustlung, but I believe he died again by bullets before Rustlung took him. So that's pretty much the history of it. Rustlung has always been around. No one knew, though, that's what led to Lambency. And Lambency wasn't really a big thing until later on when the lambent, or pretty much emulsion, the lambent in the emulsion, kind of decided to make its move. Decided to actually step forth and actually make itself known and start infecting and start having its own pseudo hive mind, I'm assuming, take over. So when that happened, the emulsion started becoming more of a problem. More people breathed it in, and people realized, hey, this is really bad. We're pretty much going to become glowing zombies. That's pretty much what the history of it was. As of Adam's machine going off, once that happened, it pretty much cured everyone of their Rustlung. the people who were in the very early stages, like just breathed it in and maybe just had it for a few days. Because by what we can tell, it takes some time for it to actually gestate and become a problem permanently. For instance, Marcus probably did have it. He probably did. Everyone probably did. So when Adam's machine went off, it pretty much killed Lambency, like fully. Obviously, there are characters who, like Gabe, the wave probably hit him too, but because of how far gone it is, it becomes more of a cancer at that point. So, yes, he did have Rustlung, but after Adam's machine, essentially, saying without saying it, he had cancer for the rest of his life. For instance, if Barrick and Harper were to get hit by that wave, they would have just had pretty much emulsion cancer for the rest of their lives. That's what would have happened. But with everyone who was very early on, it just pretty much eradicated it out of their bodies, and they were okay. Now, I don't think that the Locust can really get Rustlung because they're already kind of just built off of emulsion to the point where, again, Lambency is a very big problem for them. So I'm assuming that they can't get Rustlung. Ukon was kind of an exception, though, because he was at one point human, and he was given Rustlung when he was being turned. So I'm assuming that's the case. And to finish this off, really, fun fact for the human world of things, when it comes to Rustlung, it's actually comparable to something, and I don't have the notes in front of me, but it's a kind of, I think it was called like the miner's lung, or like coal lung or miner lung or something. It's a situation where when miners were out mining, they were in the tunnels or they were down below, they would breathe in like all the coal and everything, and it would just blacken their lungs. So when they would cough up stuff, kind of like what emulsion sickness would do to you, Rustlung, they would cough up like just sludgy blackness because their lungs would just get caked in black. I believe it did have some devastating effects later on. I didn't do a lot of research into it. I just kind of knew about this. And when I went down the wiki just to refresh myself, it did mention that. So I'm like, haha, I knew it. I mean, give it a couple of years of medical, like not even medical school, but just like medical classes, you do learn some stuff. So yeah, that's pretty much Rustlung in general. Horrible way to go because it really can come down to, guess what? You pretty much end up with cancer. And if that doesn't hit you, it'll just be the emulsion before Adam's machine that just kills you and turns you into a former and you become a zombie. So your options were either die by getting shot and killed with bullets, turn into a zombie, which would happen if before Adam's machine you were to die and you'd come back because it would just spread through you, or number 3, after Adam's machine you just die from cancer. That's how you would go. So that's going to do it. It's a depressing note, but Rustlung was not fun. Ask Gabe. He went through almost 50 years of it. So that's going to do it. I want to thank everyone for watching. I want to thank everyone for making this possible. And I want to thank the patrons for making this possible. Quick word also for everyone. I have started streaming. So on Mondays, I will be doing it on the channel. I haven't had a set time yet. I'm aiming for around 5 p.m. Central Time to maybe start, maybe expect later around 5:30 or 6. That's when I'm going to actually start streaming and doing things on here. I'm excited for it because the first test went really well. I'm thinking maybe I could make it, I don't know, like more of a thing, more maybe some newer games I'll do in that. I want to focus on grinding for right now, just for like Final Fantasy up the wazoo I have, so I want to get that out of the way. So just getting stronger in games, just chatting, just having a good time. So if you guys want, just join me for the streams on Mondays. Store's always open if people want to buy some merch. Subscribe, I always appreciate it. Love you all to death. Make sure you watch what you breathe in. I guess that's the best I can leave you with. Love you all to death. Later.